Firstly, a shout out to Helena from Real Deal Film Reviews for this selection. I highly recommend you go have a look at her channel for some retro reviews. The Draftsman's Contract is a release from 1982 which I'd never even heard of and probably never would have if not for the Film Review Open Challenge. So what exactly am I getting myself in for here? Comedy? Drama? Secret MCU entry? Probably not the latter, but since there's not much of a trailer for this one, I'm going in more blind than normal. Okay then, here's my review of The Draftsman's Contract. A party in a 17th century house belonging to Mr. and Mrs. Herbert, their daughter and son-in-law Mrs. and Mr. Tolman. Also in attendance is house manager Mr. Noyes, neighbour Mr. Seymour and gossiping twins, the Poulencs, as well as Mr. Neville, a talented draftsman who Mrs. Herbert and Mrs. Tolman are trying desperately to recruit to draw the house as a gift for Mr. Herbert whilst he is away in Southampton. Mr. Neville agrees, and as well as payment and full board, he gets to do whatever he likes in private to Mrs. Herbert once a day. She agrees and the contract is drawn up by Mr. Noyes. Mr. Neville arrives and is very particular about having the house, staff and animals in a certain way so that each day and each time of the day the building and surroundings are identical. He also gets very involved in family conversations. He often clashes with Mr. Tolman and during intimate sessions with Mrs. Herbert he probes her, pun intended, about the setup of the house while Mr. Herbert is away. Mrs. Herbert wants to back out after a few days into the contract, really disagreeing with the intimate nature of it. But Mr. Neville doesn't agree and the contract cannot be voided without his permission. Days pass and random items such as a ladder, shirt, boots, and even more start appearing in the background, which really irritates Mr. Neville until Mrs. Tolman points out that these items belong to Mr. Herbert, who hasn't arrived in Southampton, and that these items could be construed as evidence in his disappearance. She suggests a contract of her own with Mr. Neville where he will pleasure her once a day. On the day Mr. Neville is due to leave, the body of Mr. Herbert is pulled from the river. Mr. Neville leaves and soon the house is abuzz with revelations and gossip. Very soon after the discovery of the body, Mr. Noyes tries to blackmail Mrs. Herbert with details of her infidelity in exchange for his protection, as he believes that everyone, including Mr. Tolman, will accuse him of Mr. Herbert's murder. When this doesn't work, though, he points out to Mr. Tolman about clues in the drawings to Mrs. Tolman's adultery. Mr. Tolman buys the drawings and accuses his wife of cheating, to which she denies and suggests that the clues actually point to Mr. Neville being the murderer. A week later, Mr. Neville returns to the house and inquires after Mrs. Herbert, also asking to paint a 13th site, the river where Mr. Herbert's body was found. It was a proposed site that was rejected and has Mr. Neville intrigued, as does Mrs. Herbert's nature, which doesn't appear as grief-stricken as you'd imagine. Mrs. Herbert suggests an arrangement where Mr. Neville draws the river as requested, lunches with her and then spend the afternoon together, but this time with her being willing. In the aftermath, Mrs. Tolman enters the room and announces that she is pregnant with Mr. Neville's child, something she could not get with her husband, and it appears that this was the plan from the beginning, colluding with her mother. Mr. Neville gets to work on the drawing, and just as he's packing up for the evening, he's approached by a group of men with torches. Despite being in disguise, he recognises them as Mr. Tolman, Mr. Noyes, and the neighbours Mr. Skinner and the twins. They beat him, blind him with fire, and kill him, throwing his body into the river. They then burn all of the drawings as the film ends. Before I go any further, I have to take umbrage with Amazon Prime's description of the film. A murder mystery with a twist, clues in the drawings, witty dialogue, erotic film. I convinced my wife to watch this with me on this synopsis alone, and we both didn't like it at all. Don't get me wrong, I love a good murder mystery if it's not apparent from my stage history, and a well-written murder mystery can work on film such as Knives Out or any of the many Agatha Christie film adaptations. The Draftsman's Contract for me misses almost every mark. Not one of the characters is likeable or even that memorable, save for the draftsman himself. He is in fact an innocent contractor being manipulated by the mother-daughter combination. Don't get me wrong, he's an arrogant jerk, but he has nothing to do with the murder and meets his unfortunate ending. Anthony Higgins plays Mr. Neville, and whilst what he says is mostly white noise, he does have a nice-sounding voice. Unlike Hugh Fraser as Mr. Tolman, though, whose German accent is about as convincing as mine. The location is nice. It's set at Groombridge Place, and the drawings are very detailed and presumably for 1982, hand-drawn. There's not much else I can compliment though. The witty dialogue is wrapped up in so much 17th century language that I needed subtitles to understand the context. I consider myself fairly intelligent, but if I don't understand an English language film, then it's alienating. I'm sure there are some absolute zingers and some really good insults, but if I can't understand them, then is that clear? It's the dialogue version of, if a tree falls in the woods and no one's around to hear it, does it make a sound? The music is okay, but way too loud, something that I've been critiqued for in the past in my videos. And the story is really slow and meandering. There's a lot of talk which does very little to move things on, and the dialogue never stops. Even during the times when Mr. Neville is having his way with Mrs. Herbert, he's talking to her throughout. It reminds me very much of that Family Guy British porn skit.
Almost. 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 There we are.
Well done.
I feel that there needed to be a reason for Mr. Neville to be targeted. This murder of Mr. Herbert, for which the murderer is never actually revealed, is pinned on the draftsman for no reason. I'd take something like revenge for a female friend or family member who he used and abused, revealing and confirming my theory that the women did it. It also could have been much shorter. Finally, what is the point of the naked men posing as statues? They appear through the film posing as statues, blending into the wall, and they're barely acknowledged. Pun intended. This isn't a long review, and it doesn't need to be. I found the draftsman's contract dull, hard to follow, and I couldn't wait for it to be over. I worked hard to find some positives for balance, but overall I just didn't like this one at all. I'm sorry if you do and if I've upset you, but I have to be honest when reviewing. This film is just not for me, and I'm highly, highly unlikely to ever see it again. Next up for the Film Review Open Challenge is Grease. For now though, thank you very much for watching.